Hello, it's GN. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my Blue-White Familiars deck building philosophy. Um, there's been a lot of discussion about the correct way to build the Blue-White Familiars deck, and while I don't necessarily believe that I have the correct way to build the deck, I wanted to give some of my thoughts and the reasons behind the cards I like and the cards that I don't like in the deck. So to start off, there are a lot of different cards you can play in familiars in sort of the flex slots. Like most people agree that you want to be playing 4 Sunscape Familiars, you want to be playing 3 Archaeomancers, you want to be playing 2 Ephemerates. But then there's a bunch of cards sort of in the middle where people don't necessarily agree. So things like Merchant Scroll, Meeting of Minds, Murmuring Mystic, Modern Age Deep Analysis, Seagate Oracle, and Brainstorm. So the main dichotomy is between the Modern Age and Deep Analysis package and the Meeting of Minds Murmuring Mystic package. The Adepto Terra and a couple other players did really well at Paupergeddon with the Murmuring Mystic Meeting of Minds variant, which seems to be the predominant variant in paper, at least in Italy. But online, and I've seen some people doing well in paper with this deck list as well, but online the Modern Age Deep Analysis package seems to be more popular. So here's my philosophy behind the deck building in Blue-White Familiars. The first point is that cheap cards are good. I mean, that should just be obvious, and I'll get into that a little bit more as I go along, but they just smooth out your curve. They allow you to play more expensive cards. If you have cheap cards in your deck, they allow you to keep more opening hands, to allow you to double spell, and they make it easier to sideboard. I also want to maximize the good cards, so there's some cards that I would never cut from the Familiars deck, or that I probably would never cut from the Familiars deck, and that I think are like the pillars of the deck, and I want to make sure those cards are maximized, and yeah, make them as good as possible. The third thing is to avoid win more cards. I think that a lot of the discussion and a big argument against some cards in Blue-White Familiars is that they end up being win more, and what that means is just that they're good in games you're already going to win, and they're bad in the games that it's unclear whether or not you're going to win or lose. So the first thing is about playing cheap cards. So this is where you compare the things like Modern Age and Seagate Oracle. And I think Seagate Oracle is a perfectly reasonable card to play in the Blue-White Familiars deck, but I generally prefer playing the Modern Age, even though it's not card positive, right? So Seagate Oracle makes you a body and draws you a card. So it's +1. The Modern Age just loots you twice and then makes it 2/3. So that's card neutral. But I even think that the 1 mana less of the Modern Age is worth the downside of it being card neutral. Partially because it has flying, which helps you fight over emblems, but also just because playing cheap cards is good. It helps you to curve out more. And as we'll see in the future, like 2 mana is a lot less than 3 mana, especially when you're trying to like double spell on turn 4, or you just want to like play a tap land on turn 3, etc., etc. And this is the same reason that I don't like Merchant Scroll, is that what Merchant Scroll does is it gives you the best card in your deck for 2 extra mana, right? The problem is that the best card in your deck plus 2 extra mana is a terrible card. Like I think even the best Meeting of Minds defenders would all say that Meeting of Minds at 6 mana is not a playable Magic card. Hydroblast at 3 mana is not a playable Magic card. Brainstorm for 3 mana is not a playable Magic card. Like, these are just not things that you should be interested in. And Blue-White Familiars already looks at like 75% of their deck in a long game, and so I don't think these tutors are necessary at all, and I think they just make your deck slower. And this is sort of the reason why Hydroblast is so good, is that Hydroblast being 1 mana, countering your opponent's 1-2 mana card is okay, but if you're able to counter a 3 or 4 mana card with Hydroblast, it's incredible, because then you can use that mana to generate value some other way. So this is a bit of a side rant, but I played a lot of this iteration Legacy Delver deck. This was like I think a year ago when this deck was still around, and it taught me a couple things. But I think one thing that I kind of believe is that in fair decks, that is like decks without fast mana, I think that every deck trends towards a deck where all of the cards cost either 1 or 0 mana. And you can see this deck in the main deck has a bunch of 2 mana cards. So Murktide Regent, Expressive Duration, and Brazen Borrower are 2 mana cards, but everything else is either 1 mana or free. And I think that sort of like as the interaction gets more and more efficient, like for example, if your opponent casts Jace the Mind Sculptor, you can just Force of Will it, you can Pyroblast it, you can Daze it, or you can just Bolt it. And so you end up getting these mana positive exchanges that sort of force all the decks in Magic to lower their curve as the cards get better. That is like decks without fast mana. When you add fast mana, it sort of complicates things, but this deck sort of taught me that cheap cards are good, and also this concept that basically mana efficiency is card advantage, right? So if I can play the entire game on 2 lands, and you need 4 or 5 lands, that's, 2 or 3 cards you've invested in lands that I can then invest in playing like a free counterspell like Force of Will, or an extra Pyroblast, or an extra threat, because I didn't have to waste my cards on lands where you did. Okay, so how does this actually relate to Blue-White Familiars? Basically, efficiency is everything. So if you look at this opening hand, this was an opening hand proposed on the Blue-White Familiars Discord. You can see that you probably are going to keep this hand, but you can quickly realize that if you don't hit your 3rd land, and even if you do hit your 3rd land, you're not doing much for a while. Like on turn 1, you're going to fetch a tapped Plains, and on turn 2, you're going to play the Familiar. But if you don't hit a land after that, you're kind of just dead, especially if the opponent kills the Sunscape Familiar. With hands like this, the more cheap cards you have in your deck, the better, because in this spot, the number of outs you have in your deck goes up by 4 if you have 4 Modern Ages in your deck. And so this is a really big deal because it just allows you to cast more spells and keep more hands, which is great. Another thing is that when you have more cheap cards in your deck, it makes it easier to sideboard, because oftentimes you want to maybe you want to sideboard out Godfarth's Faithful, which is a cheap card, and you want to sideboard in, Exclude, which is an expensive card, or I don't know, maybe you're playing Murmuring Mystic in your sideboard, you want to sideboard that in. It allows you more flexibility to raise your curve post-board if your curve is lowered pre-board. And also, like, as I was saying, mana efficiency is card advantage. Even though FAMs, I don't think will ever be this sort of deck with 1 and 2 cost cards. It's always going to have Mull Drifters and Archaeomancers. Having cheap cards is really good because it allows you to do stuff in the early game, keep more hands, and then also just sideboard easier. Okay, so here's another thing that is sort of related to the last topic, which is efficiency of counterspells. So I know Callie really likes playing counterspell as a catch-all, which is great. I actually think this is a pretty reasonable choice, especially when the metagame is full of cards that Prohibit and Essence Scatter can't necessarily counter. But I generally prefer playing these cards on the left. And why is that? So the obvious reason is that they are better when you have a Famine play. Being able to counter your opponent's stuff for 1 mana is just completely broken. And like, playing against FAMs can feel kind of ridiculous when they have a Famine play. Like, you try to bolt it, they counter it for 1 mana. You try to play a creature, they counter it for 1 mana. They play an Archaeomancer for 3 mana, snap your thing, and you just die. So that's great. But then you might say, GN, you're an idiot. This is just win more, right? You're just putting cards in your deck that are only good when you have a Famine play. And to that, I actually disagree, because these cards work well with your mana base, right? So let's say your mana base is like Plains Island and a Chancery. The difference between Counterspell and Essence Scatter in this spot, or Counterspell and Prohibit in this spot, is that it actually allows you to double spell when you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. If you want to hold up Counterspell and you have a Chancery, you're effectively wasting a white mana for the most part. Whereas, let's say I had Prohibit plus Modern Age, I could cast a Prohibit and cast a Modern Age, where somebody who put Counterspell in the deck would only be able to cast Counterspell. So I think these cards are good both when you have a Familiar in play and when you don't. The other thing about win more cards, I think Meaning of Minds is very bad. I think you should not put it in your deck, and here's why. Like, basically, draw cards are at their best in interactive games, right? So if I play a thing, you kill it, you play a thing, I counter it, we 1-for-1 a bunch of times until each of us just has a couple cards left, and then I cast a draw spell or two, that's going to put me super far ahead because I have more resources relative to what you have, right? It's good in small games. But Meaning of Minds is a card that's not good in small games because it requires you to have a bunch of creatures in play. Like, 3 in a blue, draw 2 is an unplayable Magic card. 2 in a blue, draw 2 is also an unplayable Magic card. Like, basically, this card is only good when you're already winning. And, like, I'm trying to picture games with Familiars where I have 2 or 3 creatures in play and I don't win. And I feel like that's just not a thing. Like, usually when I have 2 or 3 creatures in play for a long period of time, I'm just going to win the game. Like, I don't need to draw 2 to win the game. Whereas Deep Analysis allows me to fight through counter magic in spots where I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. You can say, oh yeah, you can Meeting of Minds on their end step, that's great, but they're still just going to Pyroblast it and then kill you. Whereas with Deep Analysis, they countering Deep Analysis is just a bad deal, because you still get the flashback and draw 2 more cards. The other thing is the Murmuring Mystic. I think this card is quite bad. The reason is, against aggro, it's a 4-mana card. And so, ideally against, an aggro deck, you slam this down, you make a bunch of birds, you can block their stuff forever. But you're playing a 4-mana card against aggro decks, and you're just going to die by turn 4. Like, the games are often just already decided by that point. Or if they're not decided, like, having a 4-mana card clunk up your hand from the start is quite bad. And it also just does nothing. Like, let's say you're on turn 4 and you slam Murmuring Mystic and then pass. Your opponent has to then give you another turn without Pyroblasting this, Destroy Eviling this, bouncing it, like, or just killing you straight up. It is cool that it can make a stream of trump blockers versus aggro, but in that spot, it's not very good because it's just a 4-mana card, which is too expensive. Versus control decks, you think it'd be great, right? Because you have lots of time to, play a 4-mana card and make your land drops and then make birds with your cantrips. The problem is that the control decks are extremely interactive. So if you're playing against something like, let's say blue-red control, blue-black control, they have lots of counter spells and they have lots of removal spells. So, and you also have lots of counter spells post-board. So you're going to be, trading off a bunch of cards and one-for-one-ing each other, and you're going to get into a spot where both players are on low resources. And then you slam Murmuring Mystic, and you have nothing left because you just traded off all your resources, right? So this card is good in high resource games because you need to like spin through your library, like play a bunch of spells to make this card good. But against control decks, you don't have free resources because you're playing a super interactive game, which makes this card not very good. That was kind of a long explanation. I played a bunch with this card. I think it's actually okay to play 1 in your sideboard if you want, but for the most part, I think it's a mistake to put this in your deck. Another thing is that I think in general, in control decks and Magic, you don't, like, adding win conditions to your deck is just bad, because you're going to get into games where you need to interact with your opponent and you're going to draw a win condition instead of an interaction spell. And it's just going to be bad. Like, an interaction spell is always going to be good. Well, assuming you can actually use it to interact with your opponent. But a win condition is only good when you need to win, right? And not when you're behind. Okay. So here's another thing. Brainstorm is a card played by Adepto, and I respect him a lot as a deck builder and as a player. He's very, very good. But I think Brainstorm is terrible. And here's why. So in Legacy and in Vintage, you cast Brainstorm, you draw 3, put 2 back, crack your fetch land, boom, you have 1 mana Brainstorm, which is great. Like, extremely broken. Everybody knows this is broken. Not news to anybody. But in Pauper, you need to spend mana for your shuffle effects. There aren't shuffle effects that don't cost mana. Even Evolving Wilds effectively cost you mana, Ashbrands cost you mana, Lord Revealed cost you mana. So, or even Thought Scour cost you mana. So, other decks still play Brainstorm though. So why is it not good in FAMs where it is good in other decks? The problem is that FAMs wants to use their shuffle effects on turn 1 and turn 2 exclusively. So the most common play pattern of FAMs, like the most common turn 1 play of FAMs, is Island go, end of your turn, Ashbrands, cycle for a Plains. That is by far the most common play. And so you want to use your shuffle effects in the early game to find your lands or fix your colors, because you're effectively a mono blue deck splashing white. But Brainstorm is at its worst on turn 1. Anybody who's played Brainstorm knows that you want to save your Brainstorm for as long as possible. And so this just doesn't really work very well with the concept of playing your shuffle effects early and your Brainstorm late when you want to combine Brainstorm with your shuffle effects. Okay, so let's get to the cards I do like. The Modern Age and Deep Analysis. These cards are best friends. The Deep Analysis, against control decks, you can just hard cast it and then flash it back. And against like mid-range decks, you can even discard it to the Modern Age, and it's great. The other thing that's good with the Modern Age is that it's really good with Azorius Chancery. So back in the day, I don't know, maybe like 2021, and then like back to like 2018 or whatever, there were Boros decks that would run 4 Boros bounce lands and then 4 Faithless Looting, and they would turn the cards from the bounce land into card advantage with Faithless Looting, because you could turn those lands into action spells. And Familiars does a very similar thing with the Modern Age, where you will like play a Chancery, and well, it's a very common play pattern where you'll like turn 2 play a FAM, your opponent will kill it. Turn 3 you will float a white mana, play a Chancery, then play the Modern Age, and then discard that Plains to the Modern Age, effectively turning that card, the theoretical card advantage from Azorius Chancery into actual card advantage. Another thing is with these cards like Godfarer's Faithful that are polarizing. If you're playing against Flickertron or Walls or I don't know, some other combo deck, Godfarer's Faithful is a bad card, but you still need to have 4 of it in your main deck because of all the decks that attack you. And so with a Modern Age, you can turn the Faithful into a real card, where you couldn't otherwise. You would just be stuck with it if you didn't have the Modern Age. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a card that I like, but I realize has costs. So Lorien Revealed is a card that came out with Lord of the Rings. It's quite good. I think it sees play in like basically every blue deck in Pauper. I'm trying to think of a blue deck that doesn't play it. I don't think there is one. It's a very good card, and I strongly believe it's a good card. However, I don't think it's as good in FAMs as it is in almost all of the other Pauper decks. And the reason is these 2 cards. So when you add Lorien Revealed to your deck, you're primarily cutting lands. So currently the Familiars deck, and I think Gates does this as well, like you would cut 1 land and play 2 Loriens, or cut 2 lands and play 4 Loriens, something like that. However, the more lands you cut, the worse these other 2 cards get. So Chancery needs to have a critical mass of other lands, or it just doesn't do anything. If Azorius Chancery is the only land in your hand, it does nothing. Same with Ash Barrens. Well, Ash Barrens is good with Azorius Chancery if they're the only 2 lands in your hand, because you can float a colorless and then return Ash Barrens to your hand and cycle it. But if you draw Ash Barrens and Lorien Revealed, or Azorius Chancery and Lorien Revealed, you just basically have to mulligan, for the most part, which is not good. Additionally, oftentimes FAMs, while it sometimes does struggle with flooding out, like usually when you get to the point where you can cast a 5-mana card, you're going to win the game. So I think that Lorien Revealed is a very good card, and I'm still playing 2 of it in my deck, and I think it's worth playing 2, just for a little bit of extra filtering. It gives you a good Archaeomancer target, and then just a little bit of extra like flood insurance. It does have real costs, and so I'm not entirely confident how good this card is in the deck, and I wouldn't run more than 2. Okay, so here's some extra notes. One thing about singletons in FAMs is that when you're playing Familiars, especially, like your goal is to extend the game as long as possible, and most of the cards in your deck draw more cards. So what that means is that you look at most of your deck every game. Like, I'd say in like an average like 5-turn game, you probably look at like between like 20 and 25 cards, and if you get like to turn 14, you basically have looked at your entire deck. And so cards like Exclude in the sideboard can be extremely effective even if you only have 1 copy, because not only do you look at most of your deck in most of your games, but also you have Archaeomancer. So if Exclude is good against your opponent, you're going to draw it, and then you're going to cast it like 10 times in a game, or 5 times in a game, or whatever, which is fantastic. And that's similar with Prismatic Strand, which can be particularly effective against opponents, although you do have less time to find it, because generally aggro decks are going to not let you get to turn 10, or the game is going to be decided by then. But I really like the ability of the Modern Age to allow you to play Prismatic Strands in large quantities when it's good. There have been some metagames where Prismatic Trance has been very good, and being able to play 3 or 4 copies in your deck, in your 75, is extremely powerful. Alright, so this brings me to my current deck list. I don't think there's anything that is out of the ordinary here. You'll notice the Glacial Floodplain just as a way to get white mana off of Lorien Revealed, which I think in general is not something you want to be doing. If Lorien Revealed is your only source of white mana, it's not great. And also, Glacial Floodplain is not very good with Azorius Chancery, because if you play it on turn 1 and then Chancery on turn 2, on turn 3 you don't have access to 3 mana, which is not great. And then one thing you'll also notice is that while I do think Ash Barrens in general is better than the Obscura Storefront, I did elect to play 1 Obscura Storefront over the 4th Ash Barrens, and that's just to concede to the fact that sometimes you're going to draw an Ash Barrens and a Lorien Revealed, or 2 Ash Barrens, and having an Obscura Storefront and a Lorien Revealed is much better than having an Ash Barrens and a Lorien Revealed. Anyways, that was a very long rant. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, let me know.